Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by Dr. Touré Reed. He's professor in the History Department at Illinois State University. His research interests center on race, class, and inequality. He's the author of Toward Freedom, the Case Against Race Reductionism, which you're going to focus on today. So, Dr. Reed, welcome to the show. It's a pleasure to have you on.
Thank you for having me, Ricardo. I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you and your audience.
Okay, great. So let me first ask you, since we're going to talk today about how race gets politicized, particularly in American society, how far back in history do we need to go to find people politicizing race? I mean, how old is this idea?
Well, I think the on some level, race is an inherently political project, right? So as long as there's been race, race has been politicized. If you take this back, for example, to the 18th and 19th centuries, which is when we get the concept of what we think of as race, race started as a way to explain, as a kind of language, to explain certain types of inequalities, right? Certain types of hierarchy. So again, in the American context, race was a way, let's say, to justify slavery, and that's necessary by the 19th century, certainly. It's necessary to have a language to justify slavery in a liberal capitalist society because it's evident that slaves, and slaves would have accounted for most people of African descent in the United States at that point, were denied their natural rights. And in order for slaveholders to explain how the status of blacks was exceptional, they and their defenders developed a language of race to justify or account for the exploitation of people of African descent. So on some level, the whole project that is race is an inherently political project. And it functions, again, as a kind of language to treat inequalities that are the product of human beings, right, that are all about social relations, as if those inequalities actually are part of the natural order of things. But I think what you're probably getting at more directly is, when do liberals in the American context begin to uncouple racial inequality from political economy? And, when I wrote Toward Freedom, or at least the inspiration for Toward Freedom, was a commonplace back in 2015, late 2015, 2016, commonplace, erroneous characterization of Bernie Sanders' project, which really was more than anything else a call for a return to New Deal liberalism. But there was a common mischaracterization of Bernie Sanders' project in late 2015, 2016, coming from a lot of well-meaning activists that the DNC certainly would pick up on in not so well-meaning ways. The mischaracterization was that Bernie Sanders' project represented simply a throwback to an era of liberalism in which liberals had denied the force of racism, and that instead the claim was that liberals had tended to reduce racial inequalities to class inequalities. And the contention was succinctly described as Bernie Sanders as having been cast as a class reductionist. And what was striking to me about the time in late 2015, when the idea for Toward Freedom first came about, was that the characterization of Sanders as, carrying on a tradition of liberal class reductionists who had failed Black Americans by ignoring the central role of racism in America's racial inequalities, is that characterization was tantamount to a declaration of up is down. It was a 180-degree mischaracterization of the failings of American liberalism in the post-war era. And in the post-war era, what happens is that liberals actually, construct models of public policy projects that certainly were intended to redress inequality, but rather than reducing racism to economic inequality, it would probably be a little more accurate to say that they reduced economic inequality to either, and this would be the inequalities that impacted blacks disproportionately. Liberals that tended to characterize those inequalities, to trace them to either racism, which I think we probably all have some sense of what racism is, or race. And where the racial characterization is a little complicated, because what they would mean by race in this context, or what I would suggest that they would mean by race in this context, is culture. So again, liberal social policy certainly had failed in the post-war era to redress the inequalities that impacted blacks disproportionately. The problem wasn't liberals' disposition toward class reductionism. It was a disposition to simply trace racial inequalities to either white prejudice or the cultural failings of poor blacks themselves. And so this language of culture of poverty and ethnic pluralism will be related to culture of poverty. And even in its updated form, underclass ideology would all be ways to characterize racial inequality in non-economic terms. And that would, I should say this, contrast pretty sharply with the way that black civil rights leaders and liberals even, but certainly leftists during the New Deal in World War II talked about racial inequality. And in the New Deal in World War II, I think people tended to trace racial inequality more to mechanisms within capitalism than the behaviors of bad actors. And again, post-war, we're going to get the behaviors of bad actors as the star of the show.
Mm-hmm. Great. So, I mean, when we're trying to understand and talk about where problems that Black Americans face today, like social problems, political problems, economic problems, I mean, isn't there a sort of dynamic between class and race? How should we think about that?
Sure. I mean, I think if one were to reflect on lingering racial inequalities, which is where we are today, right? I mean, as many people pointed to, the racial wealth gap is today basically what it was 50 years ago. So when we discuss these lingering racial inequalities, I think there's no way, if one's end game is to redress them, there's no way to do so effectively without exploring the relationship between race and class. And I think in the current discourse, there's a tendency, there's an insistence that racism occupies a plane that is in some way distinct from, class, and that the problems that impact Black people are owed to the original sin of racism, let's say. And racism certainly is a facet of it, but racism is insufficient to explain why these disparities have lingered on. And I think one maybe straightforward way to describe this would come down to this. I mean, people like me are often, I would say, unfairly mischaracterized as class reductionists. I'm not someone who has ever insisted or suggested that racism is a thing of the past. I'm an in-print critic of President Obama going back to 2008, for what it's worth, to August of 2008, motivated in large part by my alarm over his post-racialism, right? Mm-hmm. So I certainly have never argued that. I've written I've written a number of essays, multiple essays, that were defenses of affirmative action, even if I might be a critic of what contemporary understandings of diversity are. Affirmative action I understand to be very important, and that's what I'm going to touch upon in a second. And so people like myself argue that if we want to address racial inequalities, then you need both anti-discrimination policies, which we have on the books, and something that we don't have on the books, which is a class-oriented agenda that's designed to raise the wages of the bottom, 60 to 80% of the American workforce. And here's where I'll get to affirmative action. Affirmative action, I think, is very much misunderstood. And among the ways that it's misunderstood is that some people argue, and I'm not one of them, that affirmative action has had no impact on racial inequalities. And that's absurd. Affirmative action has had a huge impact, not just on racial inequalities and redressing racial inequalities, to be clear. Affirmative action has had a pretty significant impact on addressing some racial inequalities, particularly among white-collar professionals, but also among the stratum of blue-collar workers, right? I mean, the number of black police officers and firemen and the like blew up. I mean, it increased substantially, in the 1960s in the wake of anti-discrimination policies, right? And of course, toward the tail end of the civil rights movement and since the 1960s. Likewise, affirmative action has been a huge boon to the professional ambitions of women, irrespective of race. So the effect, though, of affirmative action is limited, and that's where we are. And the clearest expression of the limited effect of affirmative action, if the end game, of course, is to, let's say, end black poverty, is the fact that what affirmative action and anti-discrimination policies have done, as I think Matt Brunig has demonstrated, David Manduka, sociologist, has demonstrated, is that anti-discrimination policies have prevented or helped to prevent the racial wage gap and wealth gap from getting worse than it would have been over the last 50 years, which have witnessed a massive decline in wages and living standards for the bottom 80% of workers. So the reason that the racial wage gap hasn't budged, really, wage and wealth gap hasn't budged, over the last 50 years comes down to two things. One is that there's been a decline in real wages and, of course, wealth for the bottom 80% of workers since about 1968 in the United States. I mean, the real push is 78 roughly forward, right? That's when the real decline kicks in. But you can take this back to the end of the 1960s. So that's the first thing. And the second thing is that what has prevented the wages and wealth of blacks from falling lower than it could have is policies like affirmative action, which have allowed some black people like myself or my parents, or so a stratum of white collar black professionals and a stratum of well-positioned blue collar black Americans whose jobs have not been outsourced, like firemen and police officers, to gain some ground, even as other black Americans, along with white Americans, have actually lost ground, if that makes sense, right? So if one wants to actually redress inequality and racial inequality, right? I mean, and these are going to be the inequalities that are owed to late capitalism, which impact blacks disproportionately, then you can certainly have some effect with anti-discrimination policies, and we've seen that, right? But over the last 50 years or so. But the problem is that the effect is going to necessarily be limited because black people live in the same world as everyone else. And if wages are going down for American workers, well, black Americans are Americans. And so black Americans are going to feel that too. You have to address sliding wages and living standards for everyone if one wants to eliminate black poverty, right? If that makes sense.
Yes, it makes sense. Did the war on poverty that I think was first put forth by Lyndon B. Johnson have had any positive effects on, tackling issues regarding racial inequality?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I often say to people, Lyndon Johnson, because I was born in the 70s, I have the luxury of attaching myself to Lyndon Johnson as my favorite president. Now, I don't think he was the best president of the modern American era, and I would actually happily assign that to Franklin Roosevelt for what it's worth, with lots and lots of caveats, but that's always a given when talking about presidents because none of them are messiahs. But Lyndon Johnson is an appealing figure for me, unlike my father, who was an anti-war activist. But Lyndon Johnson was an appealing figure for me, partly because he was the greatest civil rights president of the modern era, right? I mean, and some of the policies that we would associate with Lyndon Johnson, at least three big laws, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and the Civil Rights Act of 1968, were crucial to opening opportunities for blacks, in employment and in housing. And interestingly enough, I mean, while that would be obvious, those would be obvious outcomes of the Civil Rights Act of 64 and 68. 64 will, among other things, outlaw workplace discrimination, the Civil Rights Act of '68 will open up housing opportunities to blacks, among other things, eliminating redlining as an official practice. The Voting Rights Act in 1965 would also pay material dividends not just to black elected officials, but those black elected officials would do their part to open up opportunities for blacks in public sector work. So those three pieces of legislation had been pretty substantial boons to a stratum of black Americans, and myself among them, and a distant beneficiary of those policies is how I see myself, and other black Gen Xers and the like. So there's no question that the war on poverty had some effect. But as the war on poverty was conceived, its effect would necessarily be limited, because among the problems with the war on poverty is that you could make the case that it never really tried to eliminate poverty. It was an attempt to do anti-poverty policies, of course, on the cheap, but what on the cheap meant was an accommodation to a kind of capitalist order that was not capable of actually, sustained progress for low-skilled workers, right? It mitigated poverty. There's no question about that. And in real time, I think the mitigation was probably most apparent in the immediate aftermath. It mitigated poverty by, among other things, expanding access to social services, which would certainly be a boon to people who found themselves on the economic margins. But unfortunately, what many black civil rights activists had called for, people like A. Philip Randolph, Bayard Rustin, who not enough people know about, but even Martin Luther King Jr., who everybody knows about, what they had advocated was something that looked a lot more like the New Deal than what the war on poverty was. And so the war on poverty really eschewed the kind of major interventions, but beyond anti-discrimination policies, the war on poverty eschewed major interventions in housing and labor markets beyond anti-discrimination policies. In contrast to the New Deal, which certainly did intervene in labor and housing markets to the benefit of capital, but also in the long run, but also to the benefit of working people. And that is not to suggest the New Deal was perfect, far from it, but nevertheless, it was more ambitious than the war on poverty. And that's why black activists were demanding something that looked more like the New Deal.
Mm-hmm. So when we arrive at the 70s and with the rise of figures like Ronald Reagan and the rise of neoliberalism, what was the impact that had on the lives of black Americans and perhaps also more generally, as you mentioned, the bottom 80% of American people?
Yeah, well, the two most significant presidents of the last 100 years were Franklin Roosevelt and Ronald Reagan. Mm-hmm. And I think it's fair to say that they were the greatest presidents and weren't necessarily my favorites. Roosevelt, certainly, as I said before, is an important figure, as I alluded to, partly because Roosevelt transforms the way that Americans see democracy and the proper role of governance to the benefit of working people, right? At least that's one facet of it. The deal was an effort to create a sustainable model of capitalism, and the notions of sustainability that New Dealers embraced for capitalism required that workers share more equitably in the rewards of capitalism. Reagan is equally transformative or transformational as Roosevelt, but he's antipodal, right? So whereas the New Dealers saw downward redistribution of wealth as the key to creating a sustainable model of capitalism, Reagan and subsequent generations of Republican and, unfortunately, Democrats have embraced a model of governance that presumes that the proper function of the state is upward redistribution of wealth and the whittling away of the social safety net, and essentially some version of social Darwinism by another name for every entity in the nation or on the globe that isn't too big to fail, that isn't a multinational corporation. And for the multinational corporations, well, socialism exists for them, hence those bank bailouts and the like. But for the rest of us poor schlubs who have to work for a living, we get survival of the fittest. I think if you understand Reaganism through that lens, even beyond the matter of Reagan's horrible racial politics, one can anticipate what a negative impact Reagan is going to have on blacks. And of course, the negative impact that Reagan has on Black Americans, and I should say, to be fair to Reaganomics or neoliberalism, which would take this beyond Reagan, is that the movement away toward a public good function of governance, which was, again, spearheaded during the New Deal and was the common sense of American democracy. And when I say common sense of American democracy, I mean, it was kind of bipartisan understanding of how things would work or how American democracy should function from Roosevelt through Nixon, right? When we move away from that public good model of governance, then in which the little guy gets to benefit at least some, then all the people at the bottom really pay a huge price, right? Mm-hmm. And blacks were, of course, overrepresented among the people at the bottom. And one of the reasons to be sure that blacks were overrepresented among the people at the bottom is absolutely, without a doubt, the legacy of, let's say, New Deal era redlining policy. Of course, the catch is that while New Deal era redlining policy is complicit, it's also the case that the real estate and banking industry basically drafted redlining policy. So that was a problem of capitalist labor markets and a New Deal's accommodation to capitalist housing markets, to New Deal's accommodation to capitalist housing markets that's there. But that legacy of redlining and of course racial discrimination in the years prior to the Civil Rights Acts made blacks especially vulnerable to processes like automation and deindustrialization that were already taking place in the 1950s and were quite evident in the 1960s. And so in that context, as automation and deindustrialization further advanced, through the 80s, then cutting the social safety net the way that Reagan did would have a disproportionately negative impact on blacks. Reagan certainly used race as, I guess the best way to put this is that Reagan fought a racialized war on poor people, launched a racialized war on poor people. He certainly used the language of race to vilify poor people writ large, and it complemented the racist sensibilities of a lot of Americans in the 1980s, which he did his part to nurture.
Mm-hmm. So within the current political economic context, what do you think would be the best ways of addressing, for example, economic inequality?
Well, I mean, the best way to redress economic inequality, I think the best ways are pretty straightforward. It's unlikely a Biden administration would pursue all of them, but certainly we would need in the United States living wage policies. And so what people call the fight for 15. Now, the problem with having a fight for 15 is if you stop at 15 and don't index it, if you don't index the 15 for inflation, then eventually the 15, the value, the purchasing power of the $15 an hour would decline. But living wage policies, obviously, though, as I've said, would be vital. Pushing for policies that make it easier for people to unionize, which would be in step with living wage policies, which, to President Biden's defense, he has stated his personal investment in the PRO Act, and that may actually pay some dividends. Obviously, there's still need for anti-discrimination policies. We need housing policies that are actually real affordable housing policies, right? And of course, by Bill Clinton at the latest, the United States had moved quite sharply away from providing affordable housing in any kind of serious way for lower income people and good affordable housing. But to be fair to Bill Clinton, that process begins before him. So we need those kinds of policies, again, along with, as I've said many times and already said, in this run, anti-discrimination policies. But anti-discrimination policies alone aren't really capable of doing what we would like them to do, or at least what I would like them to do, which would be to eliminate Black poverty. I would also say, and I suspect this is part of the impetus of the question, that in order to achieve the kinds of policies that would be necessary to redress, racial disparities, given electoral mathematics, I don't know that they would be achievable without some kind of interracial coalitions, political coalitions. And I am very circumspect, and that's an understatement. But I'll stick with circumspect. I'm very circumspect about the capacity of the moral awakening that took hold this summer to deliver on those kinds of policies. I have confidence that the moral awakening that took hold this summer and carried us through the fall will deliver on policies that will benefit Black entrepreneurs. I'm confident that it will deliver on policies that will benefit a stratum of white collar professionals who happen to be Black, from myself on up, right? So, and on some level, I think I probably already benefited to a degree from such a moral awakening in my own job because of opportunities that I've had because of that. But the problem with that is, and while I'm happy to benefit, of course, that the scope of what the moral awakening, what policies that one could derive from an awakening that appeals to people like Jamie Dimon, let's say, an anti-racist awakening, are going to be, that scope is going to be limited, and it will exclude, as it long has from its purview, the Black, poor, and working class, right? Because it's going to exclude all poor and working class people, at least most of them, and there you have it. And in fact, I'll just add, I think there is also the potential for a kind of sleight of hand, because it's easy. It would be relatively easy to redress much of the racial wealth gap, because as Matt Brunig, this is the piece that I was thinking of, has shown, most of the racial wealth gap is between the top 10% of white earners and the top 10% of Black earners. And the reason for that is, once again, for the bottom 80% of Americans, real wages have declined over the last 50 years, as has wealth. And truthfully, I think it's decline for the bottom 80% and stagnation to decline for the bottom 90%, right? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so because America has a long history of Black slavery, do you think that reparations would be another way of addressing problems that afflict modern Black Americans?
Well, reparations certainly has become really appealing, and I think the succinct answer is no. Yeah. But the reason that to elaborate on the succinct answer, the reason that the answer is no, is because reparations doesn't even mean reparations to most people. Now, I don't think reparations in the true sense of the word, which would constitute really, if one were serious about reparations, that would really mean cutting some percentage, if not all of, the 42 million people in the United States who happen to be of African descent a check, right? Well, I know that's not going to happen. What reparations has taken off, not really, coalesced around cut a check, right? That's hashtag ADOS's position, and to hashtag ADOS's credit, they are serious about it. I think what most people mean by reparations is anything under the sun that is targeted to Black people that is branded reparations. So reparations can mean an apology, which I couldn't put in the bank and no one else could, and it would do nothing, of course, to redress the material woes of Black people in the United States, or anyone else, obviously. Reparations could mean support for Black entrepreneurs, imagining that, and that would be what I would call an intra-racial trickle-down project. Well, if trickle-down worked so well, we wouldn't be where we are. So the question is, why would anyone who's been paying attention the last several years should appreciate the fact that there's actually a backlash to the trickle-down, to the legacy of trickle-down that came, in the case of the Democrats, obviously through the Sanders campaign. But in weird ways, you could see this in Trumpism, which is all over the political map in many ways. I think it's reasonable, absolutely reasonable to cast Trumpism as a right-wing movement. There's no question that Trumpism is right-wing populism. But what many people in Trumpism want, or many Trump supporters want, is all over the map, and with respect to policies that would make their lives better. But many of them embrace social Darwinism. But anyway, so entrepreneurialism, if trickle down worked so well, then we wouldn't be where we are, right? And that includes, I guess, the best evidence of it is depressed wages for the bottom 80% of American workers, and yet there's a presumption driving that aspect, that end of the current reparations discourse, that blacks all share the same interest because we're black. So black businessmen are necessarily going to be better employers to black employees, and they're more likely to pay black employees a living wage. I mean, that's absurd. And I think that would be absurd on its face. And in fact, just to beat this dead horse, if that's how it worked for white people, there would have been no union movement, right? If that's how it worked for white people, there wouldn't have been a push for a minimum wage or a Fair Labor Standards Act. White employers are often enough jerks to white employees because they're not actually in the business of giving white people good jobs any more than black employers would be in the business of giving black employees good jobs. They're all in the business of getting paid, right, of making a profit. So reparations, again, could constitute entrepreneurial uplift, which I should also add is a pre-New Deal era vision for black politics that failed before the New Deal. Reparations could constitute, for many people, apparently, anti-discrimination policies, and charity is on the list of what constitutes corporate charity. Is on the list of what constitutes reparations. And again, there's no doubt that some black Americans will benefit from policies branded as reparations. The catch is, A, none of those policies that have been proposed so far are actually anything reasonably understood as reparations. And B, all of those policies, if memory serves, have a proven track record of failing to do right by the poor and working class black Americans, because they don't address the impact, the disproportionate impact of late capitalism on poor and working class black Americans. So no, I don't think reparations can actually function as a fix, as much enthusiasm as there is for it. I think, sadly, the enthusiasm is misplaced and often rooted in the misconceptions about what the limitations of New Deal era policies were, what the limitations of New Deal universalism, if you will, and again, a misconception about what those limitations were and where they came from, and also just a lack of appreciation for or knowledge, maybe, about what the war on poverty was. And if you had some sense of what war on poverty policies looked like, or Nixon-era black capitalism, if you looked at the lay of the land of what's being branded as reparations, then you might have as some would say, deja vu all over again experience, because this is all, most of what people are proposing as reparations is all kind of retrograde stuff that, one more time, has been tried and was inadequate in the 19-teens and 20s when it was black uplift, or more importantly in the 1960s or early 70s when it was the war on poverty or Nixon's black capitalism.
Mm-hmm. So in America, in black communities, we see usually high crime rates. And if we ask people on the right, they would say that those crime rates stem from single-parent families and lack of personal responsibility and things like that. I mean, what would be your response to that? Do you think that we need to look beyond that, perhaps some of the root causes of those problems that are not really related to how families are structured or a lack of personal responsibility, and perhaps also add to this question mass incarceration, where I think blacks are also overrepresented, right?
No, that's a great question. And there are a lot of ways I could go with that to answer it, and I will go this way. People seem to have forgotten that in the 1980s and 1990s and even 2000 aughts, many Black Americans were quite enthusiastic about tough on crime policies. And the reason, and I was not one of them, actually. I mean, I never voted for Bill Clinton. I've been a registered Democrat since I was 18, not because I think great things about the Democrats, but I know that I'm more likely to get something out of the Democrats than I would the Republicans, and more to the point, I want to vote in the primaries, and that's why I'm a registered Democrat and have been again since I was 18. I never voted for Bill Clinton, despite being a registered Democrat. I sat out 92 and 96. I didn't vote for Al Gore in 2000, in part because of the tough on crime rhetoric, which I would say was racist, generally speaking. But it was racist in a way that was, I think, indistinguishable from, or nearly indistinguishable from the Reagan line about crime, right, and inequality. And of course, the deal was, the reason that so many Black people embraced tough on crime policies in the 70s, 80s, or sorry, actually it's true in the 70s too, but in the 80s, 90s, and 2000 aughts in particular, is because, as you point to, the high crime rates in Black neighborhoods, right, Black communities. And I can't remember the exact statistics, but property theft rates in Black neighborhoods, and I'm using scare quotes for a reason, are several times higher than nationally. Murder rates also several times higher, and have been for a while, in Black neighborhoods, and once again using the scare quotes or air quotes for a reason. And of course, if one only, and so since Black people were more likely to live in neighborhoods that were beset by high crime rates, then no shock that many Black Americans supported tough on crime policies, right? Yeah. Because they dealt with the problems. The issue, though, that was vexing about the crime discourse in the 80s and 90s, and why I found Clinton to be so horrible, is that if you broaden the lens, right, if you didn't just apply race to the framework to understanding crime, then what you would find is not so much that there was an epidemic of Black male violence, let's say, as people talked about back then, but rather there was an epidemic of male violence among young, poor men, right? Mm-hmm. That race was much less of a contributor to the high crime rates. It was much less of a useful lens with which to, or framework with which to understand what was going on with respect to crime than poverty was. And lo and behold, those Black communities that were beset by high crime rates were not the Black community, not the Black neighborhood that I grew up in Southwest Atlanta, which was populated by, kind of lower middle class homeowners, right? And the lower middle class homeowners neighborhood. But those Black neighborhoods that were beset by high crime were also high poverty neighborhoods. So if one were serious about addressing crime, then you'd have to have an anti-poverty agenda. And in fact, the problem of high crime rates that beset Black neighborhoods dates back to the 1960s. And as I alluded to, while the real thrust of tough on crime policies that Blacks embraced, you could see 80s forward. In the first round of Black mayoral regimes, there's a big wave of them in the 70s. There were a lot of Black mayors and, motivated by their Black constituencies. to embrace, stronger policing, right? So again, because Black people were impacted by crime. The problem, though, is that the frameworks that we have to make sense of crime center on race, period, right? Or racism, I should say race and racism, period, but not class. So what that means is that conservatives will, of course, I guess by their very nature, by definition, will eschew class-based understandings of crime, because they're allergic to those anyway, and attribute crime rates to the cultural deficiencies of poor Black people, right? And for them, this became the basis for dismantling or for the rationale for a certain kind of anti-statism, right? For dismantling the war on poverty, basically, right? The expansion of social services that began that. So it was, for conservatives, the high crime rates were, as you say, the product of family dissolution, but that family dissolution for conservatives was owed to an overly permissive welfare state, let's say. Again, some of them would say. Liberals would embrace that very same framework, of course, and as I said, Bill Clinton did. But so we got that for them. And for liberals, again, liberals would embrace that same framework. And then, of course, in these more progressive moments like now, will ignore the fact that there is actually a problem of crime that many black people are actually really concerned about and apprehensive about abolishing police forces in some communities. And instead will just say that it's systemic racism that's the problem. Or that they're racist cops, and they're certainly racist cops, and it's certainly the case that law enforcement is trained to racialize criminals too, right? But what's missing, again, to beat the dead horse, is a class lens. And in the absence of the class lens, if you presume that the problems of crime are owed simply to family dissolution, as conservatives and centrist Democrats have embraced from the 90s until about 5 years ago, if that, then what's your fix? There is no fix other than build more jails, right? And in fact, I'll take that back. There's two fixes. Build more prisons, / of course, increase the length of time that people serve. So that's one. And the other is, interestingly enough, to cut the social safety nets, right? To eliminate welfare, because welfare is responsible for family dissolution and thus crime. To eliminate public housing, because concentrated poverty is responsible for engendering in poor Blacks and Hispanics a culture of poverty that lends itself to crime, et cetera, right? I mean, and so the fixes are draconian. They are to punish poor people in every possible way, rather than giving them opportunities to not be poor by creating well-paying jobs for people who are currently low-wage workers.
Mm-hmm. Don't you think that class lens you mentioned is also somewhat lacking from political discourse on the left nowadays in America?
Yeah, these days, I think many people who identify as leftists, and I don't know that I always identify them as leftists myself, but I think many people who identify as leftists certainly are allergic to class analysis. And I think they're allergic to class analysis for a lot of reasons. One of them probably is owed to Twitter and a fear of being canceled by people. And I am not on Twitter, but it strikes me that Twitter is where nuance and intricate argumentation goes to die. And that makes sense because, you can only, Twitter, the character count threshold on Twitter precludes nuance. But so one thing that's going on is oddly enough, I mean, just at the level of the individual, but that Twitter push, the fear of cancellation for a class-oriented analysis, is just a symptom. And it's a symptom, I would say, of the hegemony of Reaganism, that so much of what liberalism has become over the really since Bill Clinton is watered down Reaganism, that many people who understand themselves to be progressive embrace policies and policy constructs or just sensibilities that are shockingly conservative. And one example that I will point to, which I've already alluded to, is the insistence that the key to Black uplift, and I'm using that phrase for a reason, is entrepreneurialism. It's hard to imagine. I can take hard to imagine out. Black activists and political organizers in the 1930s and 40s literally explicitly rejected that view, right? I mean, they explicitly rejected it. And they rejected it partly because they already knew it, right? I mean, that had been the model of Black uplift before the New Deal. And the limitations of it were apparent by the 30s and 40s, thanks to the Great Depression. I mean, that made plain that Black business owners were not in the business of giving Black people good jobs. But also, everybody understood in the 1930s, 40s, I think pretty much everybody understood this, even in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, that capitalism requires that most of us be workers. I mean, we can't mainly or mostly be entrepreneurs. That's just not what capitalism entails. So we've got that going on. And then, I think and what this all augurs is the return of another pre-New Deal pre-New Deal era model of Black politics called brokerage politics, which again kind of proceeds from an ethnic pluralist framework that presumes that all Black people, because of our shared race, have the same interests, which presumes that there's a natural Black leadership class that will necessarily paternalistically do right by the Black lower classes, Black working and working classes and poor Blacks, which, again, just is absurd. It's absolutely absurd. So, all that's going on. And maybe the most important thing, and this dates back to the New Deal, is the extent to which, this dates back to the war on poverty, the degree to which the Johnson administration was able to incorporate Blacks into the Democratic Party. And as I said, I'm a registered Democrat, so I certainly vote that way when I don't sit out too. But that created, of course, a class of Black Democratic functionaries who are the emissaries of this kind of brokerage politics that doesn't really serve the Black masses well, but certainly serves a stratum of Black elites well. And there's one other piece to this that I failed to mention for some reason. And the last element of why I think many people are allergic to kind of class analysis of racial inequality at this moment is a failure to appreciate the class heterogeneity among Blacks themselves. And this is one of the victories, and an important victory, of the civil rights movement, right? The Civil Rights Acts of 64, 65, 64 and 68, and the Voting Rights Act of 65, as I said a while back, opened opportunities for, lots of Black white-collar professionals and the like, and helped to create a real Black middle class. And those are good things. There's no question about it. But what has happened, which I think many people who identify as leftists seem not to appreciate, is that where before there was, a large-ish, real Black middle class, and in a world in which most Blacks were working class, you could, make probably a fairly reliable bet between the 30s and the 60s, maybe even as late as the 70s, that the sensibilities of most Black Americans would tilt in a kind of progressive direction. That's less likely to be the case now, partly because there are actually affluent Black people, and there are actually upper middle class Black people. And there are middle class Black people who have reasonable aspirations to be upper middle class Black people. And of course, all of those Black people that I described as in the white collar professional class go to college. Many of them go to grad school. And in college, but even in high school before that, were indoctrinated in the values of Reaganism, right? Or neoliberalism, as it makes more sense to call it. And so what that means is that the class sensibilities of what people would understand to be the Black leadership class, and that's probably a construct we should retire. But the class sensibilities of the people who one might understand to be part of the Black leadership class actually don't tilt in the direction of progressive class-based politics, or at least working class-based politics. They tilt more in the direction of something that's kind of like Reaganism, with the caveat that they appreciate the utility of state intervention to create opportunities by way of affirmative action and minority set-asides and the like, for a stratum of well-qualified, nicely credentialed Black Americans. So how that connects to your broader point is that I think a lot of white people, and I've been struck by this for decades now, I'm old enough to say that I've been struck by something for decades, but anyway, a lot of white people actually see Black people as a homogeneous group. And if you're a college-educated white person whose window onto Black people is your dorm mate at Amherst, or Oberlin, or Harvard, or Yale, or hell, even University of Michigan, or where I teach, Illinois State. But if your window onto Black people is the white collar professional, managerial class, Blacks or aspirant, and you presume that all Black people share the same sensibilities because they're all subject to racism. They are all subject to racism, but we don't experience it the same way. Then this well-educated, actually quite privileged Black person is your proxy onto what all Black people think. And if this well-educated, person who took post-Milton Friedman era economics in college rejects the class-based analysis and said, Black people don't need that. Black people don't need, healthcare as a citizenship right. Black people don't need the fight for 15, because, this Black person you're talking to is your friend as an investment banker. So that Black person has health insurance. That Black person doesn't have student loan debt. That Black person makes way more than $15 an hour. Then if you're a white person who proceeds from this kind of race reductionist framework, then you just ignore the fact that this Black person is actually a human being who's not capable of speaking for 42 million Black people. That Black person's experiences are not every Black person's experience. They are the experiences they're that Black person's experience, but they may be representative of people in that class of Black people's experiences. But most people seem not to appreciate, certainly most white liberals seem not to appreciate, that there is class stratification among Black Americans. And that's a major problem.
Mm-hmm. So on arguably the more extreme side of things, what do you think about movements like Black Lives Matter? Do you think that they are helpful in trying to address these problems that we've been talking about that affect Black communities, or not?
Well, I mean, BLM is complicated because BLM does not have a central organization. And that, of course, has created, in the last several months, tensions between or among BLM activists, because they're not all connected to the same revenue streams. And of course, again, leadership often enough is reflective of local leaders rather than national leaders' concerns. So one thing you can say, and this is a plus and minus, again, is BLM is complicated. So I wouldn't be equipped or disposed to make a blanket statement about a group that has a kind of horizontal organization, because there's such heterogeneity among members and leadership. But what I could say is that many within the orbit of BLM, if not in BLM proper, are very clearly committed, unfortunately, to a kind of race reductionist framework, as I would describe it. And this would not be everyone, of course. That seems that again, I think it's on some level circumspect, if not antagonistic, to the class realities of the criminal justice system, and of course, the class realities of inequality writ large. With respect to the class class implications of the criminal justice system, the reality is that, and a number of social scientists and law professors have demonstrated this basic point, that while Black people across the class spectrum are certainly subjected to racial profiling, and I have yet to meet a Black person who hasn't had horrible experiences with racial profiling. And in fact, while my father and I are supposedly people who deny this, we've had some horrible experiences with racial profiling. And the worst of them, I was with my dad. This was in January of 1992. I thought my dad was going to be killed by a bank security guard who was shadowing us in the bank the whole time. And my dad, I don't know that my dad should have done this only because it was evident this guy might have killed him. But righteousness certainly necessitated that my dad call this guy out for profiling us. And it got very ugly, to say the least. And I've had my own experiences independently of that. So I don't know any Black people who haven't had experiences with racial profiling across the class lines. But the reality is, when it comes to incarceration, there are very few college graduates in jail or in prison. The majority of the inmate population consists of people who have no more than a high school diploma. And it's odd that I'm putting it this way, but the reason I'm putting it that way is that, and you probably knew this, but the U.S. Justice Department doesn't compile statistics on class among the inmate population. Yeah. The U.S. Justice Department only compiles statistics on race. So researchers have to use education as a proxy for class. It's not the best proxy, but it's also not the worst proxy. And again, I forget the exact percentages, but a white high school graduate is many times more likely to be incarcerated than a Black college graduate, many times more likely to be incarcerated. And of course, that's not part of the mix of the discourse, right? Again, on the street, with respect to run-ins with police officers, yeah, that affects Black people often enough across class lines. But with respect to actual incarceration rates, being able to afford a lawyer makes a huge difference in whether or not one will actually be incarcerated. And of course, the problem of crime, the high rates of crime have a lot to do with what the inmate population looks like. And so that's also not really part of the popular discussion at this moment of criminal justice and mass incarceration. And of course, BLM, after about 2016, broadened its framework to advance a cause for more kind of social justice, more broad, beyond mass incarceration or criminal justice reform policies that, put forth the vision for a more just society, which had some great elements to it. But I think one of the stumbling blocks with achieving that vision that BLM put forth a few years ago is the necessity of kind of interracial coalitions. Because the fact of the matter is, Blacks are only 13% of the total population of the United States. And it's very difficult, frankly, it's impossible for 13% of the population that's comprised disproportionately of poor and working class people to win anything in a democracy. Investment bankers can do it because they're loaded, but a minority comprised largely of working people and poor people is at a huge disadvantage for advancing a kind of agenda that would benefit poor and working people in the absence of coalitions that extend beyond a quote unquote identity group. And I think the fact that many of the leaders in BLM, the three founders of BLM, embrace a kind of race-first politics makes them, for sure, and maybe many within the movement, more disposed to make class alliances that probably won't benefit poor and working class Black people to seek corporate sponsorship, let's say. And we saw a lot of corporate sponsorship of social justice movements, including BLM this summer, without considering the fact that corporate sponsorship is not going to be consistent with uplifting poor and working class Black people, because ALEC contributors, oppose things like free public higher education or the fight for 15.
Yeah. So one last question. Do you think that it would be possible now in the current political context to bring back class to political mainstream discourse? And if so, how should we approach that? I mean, trying to move beyond race reductionistic narratives.
That's a great question. I'll ramble my way through this one. And I guess why should this answer be any different from the others in that regard? But in 2015, 2016, I certainly was optimistic about the prospects of bringing back a kind of class-based interracial politics. And one of the things that was really quite encouraging to me about the Bernie Sanders campaign is that and that was, of course, the impetus for my optimism about bringing back class-based politics, is that it had never occurred to me, given that we'd had 25 years, basically, of neoliberal hegemony, right, since Clinton, Bill Clinton, it never occurred to me that that simply making the announcement that this kind of politics is something we should pursue, like class-based, downward redistributive kind of politics is something that we would pursue, would galvanize 43% of Democratic voters. And hell, I know a lot of people who vote Republican who like Bernie. They are not, Lincoln Project Republicans, but I know a lot of kind of blue collar whites and lower middle class white people who vote Republican who loved them some Bernie Sanders, as one might say. So the fact that the Sanders campaign resonated as broadly as it did made clear to me that 25 years of, quarter century of neoliberal hegemony had not totally quenched, or displaced the possibility or appetite for that kind of politics, because it spoke to the real concerns of real people and just regular people, right? So that was great. I think where we are, but I also knew, and to be perfectly honest, this is actually one of the reasons that I thought Trump was going to beat Hillary, too. But I also knew that once Trump won, that it was going to be an even tougher fight than it might have been had Hillary won. And I think it was going to be a tough fight no matter what, to be clear, right? Because it was evident in 2016 that Sanders was not likely to win the nomination. That wasn't the point. The point was that the Sanders campaign gave reason to believe that we could build, right, and build beyond that campaign. But once President Trump won, the Democrats, with the aid, unwitting or not, of some people like Ta-Nehisi Coates, had coalesced around a narrative a race reductionist narrative that put race at the center of all of the woes in the United States. And certainly race is a facet of it. There's no question about that. But race, I think, is actually reasonably understood, if you believe in the social constructiveness of race, and I do, as a language of inequality, right? I mean, it's an ideological framework that's wed to a political project, as I said from the start. And of course, what it does is it treats as natural inequalities that are the product of social relations. But what are the social relations? The social relations aren't reducible to race or even racism, because race is that language of inequality. the social relations in an American context, or Western modern context, is going to basically come down to capitalism. And many of the problems, I think, all of the problems that impact blacks disproportionately impact everybody, like people across racial lines, I should say. But again, the Democrats and liberals kind of coalesced around this language that insisted, or this narrative that insisted, that Trumpism was owed to racism, period. And they racialized Trump voters, all of them, as if Trump was the guy who brought neo-Nazis to the Republican Party rather than Reagan, let's say, or even Nixon, if you want, right? Trump emboldened neo-Nazis. There's no question about that. That's why I voted for Hillary in 2016, because it was evident we were going to be where we are if Trump won. But nevertheless, he didn't invite them there, right? So the Democrats coalesce around a self-serving fiction, or at least a self-serving narrative that has some fictions baked into it anyway, that presume that the only reason that people voted for Trump was because of white racism, ignoring Trump's shocking showings with black voters and Hispanic voters. And he did better the second time than the first. And of course, the Democrats so coalesced around this narrative partly to push back the class agenda that people like Sanders were advocating, because it was a way to beat back the critiques of neoliberalism that Democrats, in the neoliberal agenda, that Clinton-style Democrats, Clinton and Obama alike, had actually co-signed. And so in this context, I think it's going to be a lot more difficult to move forward with the class politics, because so many liberals, and this relates to a point that you raised earlier, so many liberals see the insistence that one think about inequalities not simply in racial terms, but also in economic terms, as a denial of racism, which is bizarre, because no matter how many times, at least this has been my experience, no matter how many times you say racism's real, right? There's no question that racism's real. I've seen it, I've experienced it, there's no question about this. No matter how many times you say that, attached to, but racism can't explain it all, what liberals hear, many of them, is that you're denying that racism is real, even though you couldn't have been clearer that you're not. And so there's a vocabulary now that is entrenched that really pushes back against the class agenda. It's actually very much, as I was reminded last semester, influenced by the kind of HR-friendly anti-racism that is associated with Robin DiAngelo, that treats racism as our original sin and as essentially an ineradicable force. And that's going to make it really, really difficult. And the centrist Democrats have other tricks up their sleeves on that one. But what's necessary, I suppose, is get the message out to push back against this discourse. And frankly, I remind myself, and I've taken to reminding a lot of my left black academic friends and family, that in 2008, there were certain critiques of President Obama that I was very reluctant to make public. And I bit my tongue quite frequently in that era. And many of those critiques that I had actually, in 2008, 2009, just in anticipating what an Obama presidency would look like, were right? And I don't regret not speaking my mind all the time in that era. But I think that's given me, and I've encouraged some of my comrades to look at it this way too, given me some understanding of the value of suffering through the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune or whatever, right? Suffering through the backlash. Because in the end, I think it's pretty obvious that that the current road that we're on, the current discourse on racial inequality that insists that class is irrelevant, or at best secondary at best, is not going to pay dividends for most Black people. And we got to make that point now, not after the fact, because we need to be able to mobilize people for the next round.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay, so Dr. Reed, just before we go, apart from your book, and again it's Toward Freedom, the Case Against Race Reductionism, where can people find your work on the internet?
I've written a number of pieces in Jacobin, New Republic, The Nation, Common Dreams. My first book, likewise, is called Not Alms But Opportunity, and it's on the class politics of the nation's second oldest civil rights book, the National Urban League. And it actually foreshadows a lot of the issues that I explore in Toward Freedom. So, and that could be found on Amazon or UNC Chapel Hill's website as well.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so Dr. Reed, I hope to have you again on the show somewhere in the future. The conversation was very interesting, and thank you for taking the time.
Hey, thanks for having me, man. I appreciate it and enjoyed it. And sorry to have rambled so much, but I can't help it.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for watching this interview until the end. As you might have noticed, I've been doing this channel for 3 years, bringing you top academics and intellectuals from a variety of fields. And I would like to ask you to please visit my Patreon page and to consider making a pledge there. Even $1 would already be a great help. Otherwise, you also have links to PayPal in the description box of the interview. And please share it, leave a like, and hit the subscription button if you liked the interview. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and PayPal supporters, Karen Litzke, Anne Blanchett, Perelga Larsen, Lau Guerrero, Francis Ford, Hans Frederick Sunda, Ricardo Vladimiro, Craig Healy, Adam Kessel, Olaf Alex, Jonathan Wiesel, Anjan Kata, Jacob Klinkby, Matthew Whittingbird, Arno Wolf, Tim Hollisey, Enrique Lenius, John Connors, Paulina Barron, Philip Force Connolly, Jerry Mueller, Herbert Gintis, Rutger Voss, Bo Weingard, Rebecca Newberger Goldstein, Dan Demetriou, Robert Windegar, Rui Inácio, Arthur Coe, Zoop, Marco Neves, Colin Holbrook, Susan Pinker, Thomas Trumbull, Bernardo Seixas, Pablo Santurbano, Simon Columbus, Jorge Spinha, Phil Kavanagh, Corey Clark, Mark Blythe, Roberto Inguanzo, Mikkel Stormir, Eric Neumann, Samuel Andreev, Tiago Nunes, Bernard Hugney, Alexander Dunbauer, Omri Hickson, Fergal Cusson, Evan Bodrenko, Hal Herzog, Nuno Machado, Don Ross, João Alves da Silva, Jonathan Librant, Oslam Bulut, Nathan Nguyen, Staten T, Samuel Correa, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, J.W., João Eira, Tom Hummel, David Sloan Wilson, Yacila Deza Araújo, Eden Solon, Romain Roach, Dmitry Grigoriev, Diego Londoño Correa, Tom Roth, Yannick Punter, Adaner Usmani, my producers Izar Webb, Jim Frank, Lucas Stafiniak, Ian Gilligan, Sergio Quadriano, Luís Caetano, Matthew Lavender, Tom Van Egdam, Curtis Dixon, João Linhares, Benedict Mueller, Vega Guidi, Sardas France, and Niruban Balachandran, and my executive producers Michel Ruzieski, Rosie, and James Pratt. Thank you for all.